So, willkommen zu dem Revival der 90er Show. Wer wird, nee, wie war das noch? Nicht Wer wird Millionär, das ist ja schon später gewesen. Ne? Seit wann gibt es eigentlich Wer wird Millionär? Weiß das jemand?
Also meine Frage, ich würde sagen seit 2005.
2005, okay, 2005 ist eingeloggt. Okay, schauen wir mal, noch andere Vorschläge. Genau, läuft, ne? Sehr schön. Also es wird ein richtig bombastischer Abend. Richtig gut, jetzt auch ein bisschen bunter und nicht ganz so.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second plenary session of the 29th FMM conference. It is my great pleasure to introduce three distinguished scholars who are doing groundbreaking work on some of the most important issues in feminist economics and economics more generally, actually, today. So, looking at the affiliations of the speakers and my own role as chair, it might appear as though there's some sort of cronyism at play. But actually, I must say it is actually more or less by coincidence that I ended up chairing this session. Although, as luck would have it, two of the speakers are actually my esteemed colleagues at the University of Duisburg-Essen. But this is not part of a bigger plot or anything. Our first speaker, Izaskun Zuazu-Bermejo. I know her for a long time, but I keep struggling pronouncing her name. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Socio-Economics at the University of Duisburg-Essen. She's currently on leave from Duisburg, and she is also an external collaborator at the International Labour Organization, ILO. Is is also an associate editor of the journal Feminist Economics, and her work lies at the intersection of feminist and gender economics, labor economics, and political economy. Is's research investigates the gender dimensions of technological and structural change, with a particular focus on labor market segregation, political attitudes, as well as the economics of mental health. Her innovative approach combines macroeconometric methods with a deep understanding of social inequalities, offering new insights into labor market dynamics and their effects on various societal groups. So this would be the first speaker. And from the gendered and labor market perspective that Is explores, we then turn to another critical aspect of economic inequality, the theory and measurement of economic well-being. Our second speaker, Ajit Zacharias, has been at the forefront of this area, looking at how we can better measure and understand the welfare and deprivation that shape economic disparities. It is a pleasure to introduce Ajit Zacharias, who is a senior scholar and program director at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College. Ajit leads the Institute's distribution of income, wealth, and well-being program, where his research focuses on the theory, measurement, and analysis of economic well-being and deprivation. He has been instrumental in developing the Levy Institute measure of economic well-being, a framework that explores how labor markets, wealth accumulation, government policies, and household production all contribute to shaping living standards. Ajit's work has had a significant impact not only in academic research, but also in policy discussions, where he's very active, especially with his work on measuring income and time poverty and linking unpaid labor to economic inequality. All themes that are, of course, closely connected to the theme of this year's conference. Our third and final speaker today, Miriam Rehm, is a professor of socio-economics with a focus on empirical inequality research at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and currently the executive director of the Institute for Socio-Economics in Duisburg. She's also the spokesperson of our doctoral school on the political economy of the socio-ecological transformation, which will start next year. And Miriam's research has made significant contributions to post-Keynesian economics and to understanding the distribution of wealth, labor markets, and gender inequality. She's also very active in political consulting at the highest level, including as a member of the Fiscal Advisory Council in Austria. And as all of you are probably aware of, she has also been a member of the FMM coordinating group for many years. So I'm very much looking forward to the presentations of our three distinguished speakers. So please join me to welcome our first speaker to the stage. Is, the floor is yours. Yeah, you can just use it like this.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you, FMM, for inviting me, and thank you, Dil, for your super nice introduction. My topic, it's about structural change and technological change. And I included a bonus track because I am going to be talking also about the political economy and the political consequences of gender-biased structural and technological changes. So let me get everybody in the room in the same page. We are going to talk about structural change that is widely defined as employment and transitions from agriculture to manufacturing and services, and is basically set at the heart of dynamic processes of economic development. The canonical processes from structural change that we see how employment transitions from agriculture to manufacturing, then Aham said the evolution of manufacturing to finally get into services, are driven by men. When we look at female data on structural change, we see that women first transition out of the agricultural employment, then they exit the paid workforce, they remain a little bit out of the workforce, and then it's at later stages of structural change that they re-enter paid workforce, mostly in the service sector. I'm going to talk also about technological change. We can think of technological change from many different dimensions. We can think of technological change as washing machines, these different care, household machines, devices that make unpaid work easier. We can also think of technological change as birth control pill, but in this case, what I'm going to focus on is technological change defined as shifts of the frontier between tasks performed by humans and machines. I will really be focusing on technological change in the production function. Technological change and structural changes are complex processes embedded in gender systems that tackle two different dimensions of different economic processes and phenomena, like economic development, secularization, and also societal dimensions from raising education attainment, urbanization, and fertility, as I was talking before about the birth control pill and so on. The gender-neutral analysis of structural change and technological change should not be the default. Gender gaps are not only a social issue, but also a macroeconomic one. I am here in order to convince you about this. Full disclosure, I was not trained as a macroeconomist. I was trained as a political economist. So I'm gonna show to you some work that I'm doing on the political consequences of structural change and technological change. We are witnesses how liberal democracies are challenged by job displacing effects of structural change and technological change. And this is fueling the rise of radical and far-right. Labor market outcomes affect political attitudes, and this differs by gender. So I'm gonna I'm gonna address these three different dimensions through papers that I've been working over the last 3 years. I'm gonna be very, very systematic. I'm gonna present you the paper, then the puzzle, data methods, results, puzzle, data methods, results, until the last part of the presentation when I will wrap up with conclusions and for the debate. So the first paper that I'm gonna present to you is called Structural Change and Gender Sexual Segregation in Sub-Saharan African Countries. Structural change has been really addressing a lot of attention from scholars, and the processes in Sub-Saharan Africa countries has been widely analyzed. It's been widely analyzed how productivity levels, productivity growth rates, and sectoral gaps in productivity have occurred in Sub-Saharan African countries, as demonstrating these for super deep analysis. We have these pathologies that have been identified in the literature, such as the premature industrialization, meaning that some countries, instead of having this process, the canonical process of structural change, they don't really develop manufacturing and industry, and they just skip into low productive service sector. And also another pathology is structural heterogeneity. However, structural change labor market outcomes in sub-Saharan African countries are far less understood, let alone the gender effects of these processes. However, we already have the theory in order to study structural change from a gender perspective. We can go back to the very early studies of structural change, like Kuznets, Lewis, and Bosserop, and also consider the work of some of the wonderful feminist macroeconomists that some of them are here with us, where they started to look at structural adjustment programs from the IMF in specific countries, and they started to consider how these structural changes and these structural adjustment programs have different effects for women and men in global South countries. In this paper, what I'm gonna analyze is the structural change impact in gender sectoral segregation in sub-Saharan African countries. And I'm gonna consider two different explanations behind this sectoral segregation within different sectors in these countries. One idea behind why we see different women, why we see women going through specific sectors and men going to other type of sectors is the comparative advantage argument. Productivity levels, rising productivity are related to reducing physical requirements, and this is considered using this comparative advantage argument that this leads to an increasing demand for women's work. However, feminist scholars have considered other more radical considerations behind this gender segregation and consider how gender stereotypes, discrimination, and competition for good jobs that mainly are in industrial jobs in the process of structural change until the later stages of high productive sectors, how these jobs, women through these gender stereotypes and discrimination are limited the entrance in these jobs. So I'm gonna consider these two different explanations behind gender segregation and see which one, or using econometrics, which one seems to be more plausible. I'm gonna use data for 10 industries, using 10 industries operating in 11 sub-Saharan African countries using the Africa Sector Database, elaborated by Debris and co-authors. This database provides formal and informal employment. This is highly important because we know that women concentrate in the informal and vulnerable employment. So looking only at formal employment will really leave a lot of things that are going on gender gaps out of the analysis. Gender sectoral segregation has been already considered in the literature, a paper by Boruman and Claesen, and they saw that gender sectoral segregation is relatively low in sub-Saharan African countries. At the same time, they identify, as I do in this paper, that female labor force participation is persistently low in these countries. So here I'm gonna consider this hypothesis that we might see nonlinear relationships between aggregate labor productivity and gender segregation. I'm gonna use an IB strategy. I'm gonna instrument female labor force participation using lags of the household composition, using size composition and age of the household, the average age of the household, to consider how the dissimilarity index, that is gonna be the measure of gender segregation, is affected by aggregate labor productivity and the square term, meaning that there might be some nonlinearities. Of course, I include the different control variables that are empirically informed from the previous literature. Our outcome variable here is gonna be the dissimilarity index that refers to segregation. Something that is kind of misleading in the literature is when we talk about how women and men segregate and concentrate in different sectors. One thing is to talk about segregation that really considers the distribution of male employment and women employment and how this differs. And another thing is to talk about representation, that is really about the share of women out of the all all employees in that precise sector. We are going to use this index of dissimilarity from Duncan and Duncan, super canonical, super use, gives the percentage of women who should trade sectors in order to bring about a gender an equal gender distribution between sectors. So just to give you an idea of, in order to really consider segregation and representation, two different things, this is important because in the next paper, I'm gonna refer to shares of women that is gonna be representation. So here we have the percentage of women out of the female employment in each sector. These are the 10 sectors that I have: utilities till agriculture. Then the percentage of male employment, and then the relative labor productivity. So we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, in this subset of sub-Saharan African countries, agriculture makes like a huge percentage of both female and male employment. At the same time, agriculture has a very low relative labor productivity. In contrast, finance and business services is highly productive relative to other sectors, and mainly, there is a higher concentration of male employment there relative to women, and again. So basically, this is the idea. This dissimilarity index, what makes is to, I don't have a pointer, right? Yeah. No, you don't. You do not have a pointer. No, why not? Surprise. So the similarity index is this difference. Here there is no difference in manufacturing. So taking these differences, and then I think maybe my point is maybe already made. So here is how aggregate labor productivity and the index of dissimilarity. Here is the the percentage of women who should go to another sector in order to have the same distribution of male employment. So we see here a lot of heterogeneity. We see Zambia is a huge outlier. Over this period of time, between 1960 till 2010, Zambia increased labor productivity in an incredible path. So we see this negative relationship for Zambia, but not for others. And also we see some kind of non-linearities for the case of South Africa. So I performed the econometrics, and this is the result. We see that at initial levels of aggregate labor productivity increases, this makes a negative effect in the dissimilarity index. 1% increase in aggregate labor productivity is associated with a minus 0.6% in the dissimilarity index. However, if we increase this 1% of aggregate labor productivity at different previous levels of aggregate labor productivity, we see that this effect is still negative, but reduces in magnitude. For high-level aggregate labor productivity, the relationship is no longer significant. So I'm going to give you some of the takeaways for this first structural change paper. I found a significant role of structural change that is proxied by aggregate labor productivity gains in gender sectoral segregation in South African, in a subset of sub-Saharan African countries using IB strategy and a higher industry level disaggregation than previous works. Gender-sensitive analysis and empirical analysis using, for instance, in my case, household composition and size, are useful to disentangle their production and production sides of structural change, even though I am not really tackling unpaid work here, as it's suggested by Elson in her last book. So basically, I found non-linearities. Initial increases of productivity lead to more equal distribution of sectoral employment, but further increases of productivity might unleash gender competition for specific sectors. Just to wrap up these papers, structural change can be seen as a dynamic process, a la Pacinetti, if you want, on that the economic development processes are not static, but rather dynamic processes, driven by continuous structural changes and composition of output factor endowments, or even technological change or technological progress. Speaking of which, this is my second paper that I wanted to talk to you. It's Robots and Women and Men, as its title says. It's going to be about robots. It's for comments in feminist economics. This is going to be an alarming thing. 2/3 of Europeans believe that robots and AI will destroy more jobs than create new ones. Gender consequences of robotization remain relatively underexplored, and evidence is inconclusive. Generally, the focus of these papers are case studies for the US or rich countries. They use aggregate levels and mainly focus on gender wage gaps. In this paper, what I want to talk about, when I want to analyze is whether and how industrial robots associate with share of women in manufacturing industries. Right now, we are not longer talking about gender segregation, we are talking about representation in different sectors. The share of women out of all the employees in that precise sector. And I'm gonna focus on manufacturing because it's the most robotized sector in the industry, in the economy, and I'm gonna use different industries within manufacturing. I'm gonna bring about mainly 2 different strands of the literature. I'm gonna draw on the literature on the employment effects of robotization, like Ajit and Treeck and their co-authors. I'm gonna also draw on the defeminization of the manufacturing, an idea, a body of literature that has been developed in feminist macroeconomics, in which they found that technological upgrading and labor productivity gains are associated with reducing the share of women in industrial jobs. I'm gonna add a little bit to these previous strands of the literature in order to consider to what extent levels of female labor force participation matter in the effect of robots, or more generally technological change, in the share of women in this specific sector that is manufacturing. Some of the recent literature saw that at high levels of female labor force participation, AI and robots unleash positive effects for women. Relatively less happy story is what we found from feminist macroeconomics, that they found that high levels of female labor force participation are associated with more defeminization of industrial jobs. 10 minutes, woof. Okay, I'm gonna speed a little bit. So I created this panel database in which I have 11 manufacturing industries for 14 countries during 1993 and 2015. Here is the sample of countries. They are mostly emerging. Most of them, they are export-oriented. There is a huge outlier that is Japan, that is the worldwide robot exporter. Dropping Japan from this analysis does not change the results. I'm gonna use an interactive dynamic panel data modeling, which I consider that previous realizations of female shares in the manufacturing affect current shares of the manufacturing. I'm gonna include robots, female labor force participation, and the interaction between them. I'm gonna use a classical Bartik-Sock type measure of robotization that you have here, using the hyperbolic sine transformation. And something that I am really happy about is that I managed to get data on the level of employees from 1980. I am collecting data from many different sources. Some of them start in 1993, like the measure for robots started in 1993. But for UNIDO, that's the source of data for manufacturing industry, like how many women are in its manufacturing industry, this data starts in 1980. So I managed to give this share with this starting point of 1980. It's also done in the reference literature in robotization. So we I kind of believe that this makes me a little bit of exogeneity. Anyways, I'm gonna use generalized method of moments, and I will endogenize the key variables. So here is a little bit how the industrial robots per 10,000 employees look like, and also the share of women in its industry. We see that, generally speaking, automotive that is highly robotized happens to be less feminized, but textiles that is hugely feminized has no robots or very low level of robotization. Here is the long difference correlation from the from the first data point to the last one, and we cannot really see. We see a negative relationship, but we cannot extract any information here. Here is the computation. I mean the classical ugly table of regression analysis, in which I want to draw your attention on the last one. That here I use difference EMM, where I endogenize robotization and female labor force participation. And what I found is that robots are significantly associated with female shares in industries in the manufacturing. And the interaction between robotization and female labor force participation is negative. So maybe we can see this better in a graph. In the back of this graph, you have the histogram for female labor force participation with the density. And here, this straight line, you have the marginal effects for 1 percentage point increase in robots. And we see that it's positive, but it reduces as we move far in the female labor force participation line. Conclusions: robotization seems to affect, at least based on this database and these countries, seems to affect the share of women in manufacturing. These results align with previous literature, but add this confrontation between female labor force participation. The context matters, something that you might have to go to the paper to read because I don't have time. Other relevant factors that I can identify is the country income levels and sectoral productivity levels matter for this relationship. 5 minutes, okay. So, and this leads me to the last paper that is co-authored with Ipek. We started this as colleagues in Sapienza University 6 years ago already. It's how gender intersects with paid and unpaid work status in political ideology, evidence from homemakers in Spain. Just to give like an interlude between what I was saying before and what I'm going to talk about now is that job displacement effects of technological change and structural change can affect political attitudes. This is something that is found in the literature of political science. And gender differentials impacts of these technological change and structural change have been understudied. Gender gaps in political ideology, usually they are measured in this heuristic Likert type scale, from 1 being super leftist, 10 being super rightist, transformed from traditional gaps where women were more right-wing to modern gaps where women are more left-wing in most Western countries since the 80s. Evidence for Italy and Turkey showed that this right-winging for women is really related to the labor market status of these women. So we consider this previous evidence for Italy and Turkey, and we use monthly survey using individual data from Spain, monthly. I mean, this is something that I want to highlight, from 1993 till 2019, and we showed that Spain adopted a modern gap, meaning that women are more on the left than men as of 2018. And this was mainly driven by women who are in the paid workforce. We are going to use an IB strategy, profit models using the probability. The dependent variable is going to be the probability of being left-wing. Just to give you the evolution of political ideology in Spain, here women are in blue and men are in red, just to give you like a little bit of a cognitive dissonance of the color palette. So we see that, over the period, women were more on the right. Here is higher values mean right-wing position, lower values left-wing positions. It was not until 2018, really, where women started to be more left-wing than men. We do some calculations, I mean, the IB strategy profit model that I showed to you, and when we separate women and men in the labor force and women and men who are not in the labor force, we see here that this is the probability of being left-wing. So men have 30% probability when they are not in the labor force to be left-wing, whereas when women are not in the labor force, they have less probability. And this reverses for when both are in the labor force. One of the conclusions is that the polarization between women and men in the paid workforce is lower. Just to go through the conclusions of the whole talk, structural change and technological change lead to profound gender differences that can distort gender-equal sustainable economic development and strategies. We can identify some non-linearities and dynamic processes that might contingent on specific factors. Initial gains might get disrupted by increasing competition and new forms of discrimination. As of the industrial policies that we can derive from these industrial implications, the policy implications that we can derive is that industrial policies should be accompanied by gender-aware assessments, at least from one side, like considering the distribution of the job displacing effects of structural change and technological change, and also the gender composition of newly created jobs through technological augmentation. Structural change and technological change lead to job displacing effects that can fuel gender political polarization and mechanisms that these are mechanisms that we should explore in further research. I cannot go back. I cannot go back and forth. Okay. So, yeah, my last words is I think feminist macroeconomics is a perfect platform to consider not only gender differences between women and men, but also going beyond the gender binary and consider differences in labor market outcomes from LGBTQ plus people, as is done by Budget and co-authors. Yeah, so don't have time.
Okay, so we'll do questions and answers at the end and go straight to the second presentation by Ajit. The floor is yours, Ajit.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm grateful to the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies and the Macroeconomic Policy Institute for the invitation. Thank you for the nice introduction, Tom. I appreciate that. My remarks are based on the work I've done in collaboration with colleagues at the Levy Institute and elsewhere. I think today morning I counted 6. Tom Masterson, Michaelis Nikephoros, Ipek Ilkarakjan, Emil Memes, Valerie Ekual, and Luisa Nassif Paris. So it's also good to be, I don't think I've ever been so many with my co-authors at the same conference. So it's a really good experience. But I have to say that the responsibility for anything outrageous or trivial that I say today rests completely with me. You can't hold my co-authors responsible for that. Now, I think there was some miscommunication between us, Tom, about the title of what I was going to talk about. I'm sorry about that. But I'm definitely not going to talk about economic well-being, although we could in the question answer or in the discussion session. I'm focusing more on the whole idea of engendering policy models. And I'm going to pick up on 2 themes. One about theory and focusing on the theory that underpins what is the dominant game in town, which is computable general equilibrium models. And then I'm going to turn to a methodological consideration, which applies to the mainstream and the non-mainstream models. Empirical policy modeling should be guided by theory. The internal consistency of the theory underpinning the modeling and whether it speaks to observable facts relevant to policies are therefore crucial. In the first part of my presentation, I will assess whether the efforts to integrate gender into marginalist general equilibrium policy models from this perspective. For this purpose, I will use a simple general equilibrium model that represents the analytical essence, I think, of these efforts to include gender considerations. The second part of my discussion starts out with the point that empirical policy modeling should incorporate engendering from an intersectionality perspective. Gender inequalities and outcomes are often intertwined with other forms of inequality, such as those based on class, race, ethnicity, caste, and more. Focusing on inequality between subgroups should not come at the cost of neglecting intra-subgroup inequalities when evaluating policy impacts. This methodological consideration applies to both heterodox and mainstream models. Okay, to start with general equilibrium, the setup is as follows. All standard assumptions of the basic marginalist theory are assumed to hold. We have a large number of households, say N. There are two factors of production, female labor and male labor. There are two commodities, X, which is produced only inside the SNA boundary, and H, which can be produced inside or outside the boundary, like, for example, childcare. The endowments of each household consists of the potential labor of women and men, which is measured as the maximum amount of time that can be allocated to work either inside or outside the SNA production boundary. Our households have well-behaved unitary utility functions. So they maximize utility according to the quantities or the mix of the SNA good, the non-SNA good, as well as the leisure enjoyed by the female and the male members of the household. So leisure is simply potential labor minus employed labor. Finally, turning to the production side, we have production functions that are described by the output of each of the industries are related to the male and the female labor employed in each of the industries. Given the assumption of perfect competition, each industry consists of a very large number of small identical firms, so aggregation is not an issue. The conditions for equilibrium in this type of setup are well known. The important question is whether these conditions make economic sense, not just from an alternative theoretical point, but from the point of view of the theory itself, of the general equilibrium theory itself. Whether do they make sense? Now, to get to that, we need to consider that well-behaved demand functions, factor demand functions, are essential for determining the gender allocation of SNA and non-SNA work and of leisure between men and women within this framework. To achieve well-behaved demand, we need to assume certain things about the technology of the two industries. So the question is, what are those assumptions? Do they make sense or not? Again, sense is defined as coherence within the theory. Now, before we get to that, let's just note that cost minimization in this type of a framework means certain things, right? A perfect competition in the factor markets would mean that men's wages are the same in both industries. The same holds for women. So when costs are minimized, the ratio of the marginal products of male and female labor in the two industries will be identical because both would be equated to the same factor price ratio. Right? Therefore, we can use the production function of either industry to qualitatively characterize factor demand functions within this framework. So I'm not going to use any particular notation to distinguish between industries. Following the standard analysis, we can show that the factor demand, the factor substitution matrix is given by the inverse of the Hessian matrix with, I believe, obvious notation here as to what those symbols mean. Now, if that inverse exists, we know that the factor demand functions will slope downward to the right, meaning that the principal diagonal elements of the factor substitution matrix will be negative. And they will also imply symmetry, an economically dubious property, but an inevitable result of the marginalized cost minimization framework. Now, to make matters concrete, let us suppose that the technology is Cobb-Douglas, right? Then we can show that the existence of the matrix there on the right side depends, or really boils down to two conditions, right? So those conditions can be expressed in terms of the inequalities that are shown for H1 and H2 in the bullet points here. Now, if there are decreasing returns to scale, that is, if the exponents of the production function, the sum of that is less than 1, we have decreasing returns to scale, and the two conditions will be satisfied. But if you have constant returns to scale technology, then the exponents will add up to 1, and we can see that that would mean that H2 will be equal to 0, and the condition will not be met. The question then is, which is the reasonable assumption regarding technology, right? Now, it seems implausible to me that in an economy with just male and female labor as the only factors of production and a large number of households, there will be decreasing returns to scale. In the neighborhood of equilibrium, there is really no reason to expect that the technique combining male and female labor cannot be replicated to supply a little bit extra of either commodity. For example, if the non-SNA commodity is childcare, the additional demand generated by an extra few kids could be satisfied easily by deploying male and female labor in the same proportions holding previously. So, however, the constant returns to scale poses problems for engendering. The key parameters in this exercise are households' subjective trade-offs between the SNA and non-SNA products. Further, the subjective trade-off between leisure and labor is also a crucial parameter of the theory. For these preferences to matter, changes in demand conditions should influence the equilibrium allocation of male and female labor between the two products and between labor and leisure for both men and women. This link is broken when constant returns prevail. In other words, the so-called non-substitution theorem takes over. Household demand and endowments cannot affect the allocation of male and female labor between SNA production, non-SNA products, and leisure. Okay, let's set aside this issue and assume that decreasing returns do exist in the model. This would allow the familiar principles of substitution in production and substitution in consumption to do their job, to bring about the supply-demand explanation of the allocation of male and female labor. But there is no way to exclude, even when all the assumptions of the theory are satisfied, the existence of multiple equilibria. I illustrate this using a numerical example of the general model that I just sketched. The result is shown in the slide for the SNA commodity. Excess demand for the commodity is plotted on the vertical axis, and its price is on the horizontal axis. Let us recall that general equilibrium happens when excess demand equals 0. As we can see, the white line depicting excess demand cuts the horizontal axis at 3 different points, which indicate 3 different equilibrium prices. Well, equilibrium prices in marginalist theory are ultimately indices of relative scarcities. It's theoretically incoherent, I would argue, to postulate that the same set of endowments and preferences can result in very different price vectors. So the supply-demand explanation of the allocation of male and female labor and the distribution of income among households in our model once again seems to have arrived at a theoretical dead end. As many of you may recognize, what I've illustrated is the well-known Sonnenschein-Mantel-Dibroux theorem, which Alan Kerman famously described as a palace revolution and not a revolt of the lower classes. That is the class to which most of us in this room belong. So let me just turn to methodology now. Let me begin by saying that I wanted to actually begin this part of the presentation by recalling this conversation that I had with Sue Himmelmeit, who is here, several years ago at the 100th anniversary of the CJE, of the Cambridge Journal of Economics. And I believe that was the first time that I met her. And I was presenting some work on economic well-being at that time, and which uses the household as a unit of analysis. And around 20 years ago, prior to that, the notion of the head of the household was dropped in the US Census Bureau surveys, and that switched to this idea of the householder. So, which meant that it's not necessary that in a married couple household, the husband will always be designated as the reference person, as the householder. So Sue was jokingly telling me that when the head of the household designation was being used, she wanted to shoot the household head. So in a similar vein, I want to say that I want to shoot the representative agents, and I'll try to explain why I'm saying what I'm saying. Now, in models assessing gendered outcomes, the concept of representative agent is very common. The idea is not limited, as I said before, to marginalist models. It also appears in some non-mainstream models. So the standard way to evaluate distributional outcomes is proceeds by like 2 axes of differentiation in standard models. Right? There is a distinction between factors, like I discussed the example of male and female factors. You can go finer. You could distinguish between male, rural, female, rural, and whichever way you want to cut it. Or it's like between different types of households. Again, you can deploy a very detailed taxonomy or a less detailed one, depending on what the purpose of the modeling is. Now, what do these representative agents do? Well, that depends on the theory. In general, they supply labor to various sectors of the economy, produce non-SNA services like childcare, purchase commodities, including like acts of saving, purchase of financial assets or the others, and engage in leisure activities. Now, the main limitation in this methodology concerning inequality is that it cannot capture within group inequality. Now, it turns out that most macroeconomic shifts typically lead to changes in both between group and within group inequality changes. Usually, the within group change is more dominant than the between group inequality changes. So therefore, relying on the representative agent approach would be equivalent to ignoring the intra-group inequality, which often is the most significant factor that affects changes in inequality. So more generally, the point is that intersectionality involves looking at outcomes through the lens of inequality across subgroups and inequality within subgroups. So this would mean, for example, to illustrate with a practical example, that if I were to study the distribution, the macro and the distributional outcomes of, say, a policy which liberalizes the access to microcredit for women, say in India, I would want to look at that not just in terms of men and women, let me start again. Generalizes, microcredit, liberalizes microcredit access to all. So I want to look at the outcomes in terms of men and women, but I also want to look at women by caste, by upper caste, by OBC groups, by SCs, the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes. But I also want to look at the inequalities within each of these groups, because we know from studying the political economy of India over the last 30, 40 years, that a significant, what's called in India as a creamy layer, which is a rich or a relatively rich, Nuwa-rich, among the disadvantaged, previously disadvantaged groups have emerged. You find the same phenomena when you study racial inequality in the US. It's important to pay attention to the within group inequality too. Sorry? That's plenty. Okay. Now, a sensible alternative, I would argue, is to replace representative agents with a representative sample of households and individuals. This is what we do in the Levy Institute microsimulation models developed by Thomas Masterson, with perhaps minimal input from me and other colleagues. Let me illustrate the difference between the two approaches by sharing results from our upcoming study on Mexico, part of which looks at the effects of implementing a universal elder care program in Mexico. I want to present the results about earnings. Now, our model generates the entire post-intervention earnings distribution, enabling us to estimate or say something about how the program might impact workers at different parts of the earnings spectrum. Conversely, a representative agent approach would only provide us with the post-intervention average earnings. Now, how can we say anything about workers at the different portions of the distribution if we were to use the representative agent method? Well, a usual strategy here is to assume that earnings follow a standard distribution. A common and a reasonable choice is the log normal distribution. Making this assumption and using the post-intervention average wage, along with the pre-intervention variance of the wage, allows us to generate an estimated, an artificial post-intervention earnings distribution, right? So then we can compare that post-intervention earnings distribution created by the representative agent method compared to the full model or the RA method, right? So that's what is shown in the next figure. So the figure compares these two methods, the results from these two methods. The symbol, like the notation Levy, represents our microsimulation results, and RA stands for the representative agent method. Now, because the RA method drastically overstates the distributional shifts, the changes that happens between men and women across the percentile groups by our method seems quite small, but they're not really that small. but they're definitely smaller than the RM method. Given the nature of the Universal Elder Care Program, it's difficult to believe that the changes produced by the RM method are anywhere near the ballpark of what would be considered as reasonable changes. I would argue that our assessment that the overall distribution will see not such drastic effects is perhaps a more reasonable assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ajit. So the last speaker is Miriam Rehm. I think there has been a slight change in the title of the presentation, which is Gender, Wealth, and the Socio-Ecological Transition. Miriam.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks also a lot for the kind introduction, Till. I will be speaking today about two of my research areas that I've worked on in the past, gender wealth gaps on the one hand and wealth models, macro models of wealth on the other hand, and trying to get them under a common arch. And then I'll try to connect that and make that part of the arch, looking into the socio-ecological transition. That is a newer research field, and you will find that it's perhaps less unified and maybe a little bit more disparate than the first two. But to start off with, the gender wealth gap. In this field, we are faced with a key challenge that was discussed already on yesterday's panel, that data is very often, that we have a lack of data in gender research in general. And in wealth research, the issue is that data is generally collected at the household level for wealth only. In contrast to income in many instances, usually we have only household level data because the household is still a black box in wealth research. And the key source of data that we have in Europe, the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, the HFCS, which we'll encounter throughout the presentation today, is one of these instances. So in our first paper on the topic, we tried to get around this by looking at single adult female households. Here I show you their distribution over the net wealth distribution. So at the bottom you have the wealth deciles, lowest smoothed. And you can see that the share of female households on the y-axis is declining as we move towards the top, which shows you already the key point that this entire literature is making, that there are gaps, and we show this then also in a quantitative regression in this paper, that there are gaps in this case in gross wealth in assets after controlling for a host of other assets. So identical households of single adult females and single adult males have different levels in wealth, and these are not only statistically significant but economically. So the gaps for the 4 countries where we can ascertain them econometrically are between 27% and 48%. So identical female and male adult single adult households have a quarter to half less. So the women have a quarter to a half less wealth. Now, we were looking at this in more detail for Austria in another paper with colleagues of mine. For the intra-couple wealth gap, Austria is one of the few countries within the HFCS which also asks then which share of this total wealth belongs to you personally, and therefore we are able then to divide the wealth between women and men. And what we see is that the gap increases towards the top, clearly. So you have here the percentiles for couples net wealth, and then the intra-household gender wealth gap in euros. But that is uneven, as you can also see, right? There are percentiles where there's a negative gap, where the woman owns more wealth, and especially towards the top, where there are substantial amounts of wealth held by households, the gap increases. And we also find in the econometric analysis in this paper that it can be explained by variables that we then interpret as approximating power within the couple. So that would be, for instance, differences in education, differences in age, differences in migration background. These help explain these gaps and render them then statistically insignificant, right? Because they're fully explained by these covariates. If you look at these variables that can be interpreted to denote power. What we did in the next step, in the next paper, was then check with a variable that actually captures decision-making power within couples. And again, here I show you the descriptive analysis instead of going into the econometrics. On the left-hand side, you have women's net wealth in 3 categories, households in which they state, in which the responsible, the household respondent states that the woman has more decision-making power. Then the vast majority say they have joint decision-making power and also that they have the same level of wealth. And then in sort of a copper, you have the no decision-making power, where the man has the decision-making power. And you can see on the right-hand side that for men, in both cases, wealth is correlated with having more decision-making power. So if the man has more decision-making power within the couple, they are also likely to have more wealth, but that only applies to the top, right? Starting the 75th percentile, but really at the 90th percentile is where we see that this gap starts to open. And this is what we perceive in all the gender wealth gap research, is that the gap is most noticeable, is most sizable at the top, where there really is a lot of wealth as well. I'm sure you're aware wealth is incredibly unequally distributed, much more unequally than income. And so the volume of wealth is really concentrated at the 90th and above percentile of these distributions in countries like in most high income countries, but especially Germany, also the US and Austria. And so towards the top, you see that decision-making power leads to higher wealth of the person holding the decision-making power, but this effect is stronger for men. So this is again something that we see the patterns hold for both genders, but men, a stronger effect is stronger. Yes, and so then in riff regressions and decompositions, Kitagawa decompositions, we show that decision-making power can explain parts of the wealth gap, and especially at the top. So we are able to explain the gap through this decision-making power variable in couples. Now, as a quick sort of summary, the data collection, as I said, is often still at the household level. The household in wealth data is still a black box, even to this day and age, where you would have thought that feminist economics has really made inroads in opening this black box, but this is not true for wealth research, and we really need to go around and take the back alley in order to try to differentiate within the household. Men tend to have higher wealth levels on average, but this is driven really by the top of the distribution, where there is a lot of wealth, and that then implies that gender wealth gaps are larger at the top of the distribution. This is where we can usually ascertain them econometrically. And we show that higher wealth, at least in Austria, is linked to decision-making power within the couple. And again, this is especially true for the top of the distribution, where we see that men who have decision-making power have substantially higher wealth. And now here we are entering the realm of speculation, but we hypothesize that this may point to a continued relevance of patriarchal norms. When there is wealth, the man owns it, and he also has the decision-making power. And incidentally, this is often related to the ownership of business assets, to owning firms. Now, I'll be moving to the second part of the lecture, where I'm looking at macro models of wealth, another area of my research that I've worked on for some time. These are structural macro models following the work by Kaldor, Kalecki, and Pasinetti, and part of a spate, really, of recent literature on wealth models, starting with Paley, Kumar et al., Taylor, Peter Gentavani, Daniel, who can unfortunately not be here today. Özlem has worked in this area with co-authors. In our model, in several iterations, we have mixed income for both workers and capitalists. There's wealth accumulation through savings, so an endogenous feedback on growth through the endogenous wealth distribution. Firms invest and produce. We include differential saving rates and differential rates of return that are defined through the portfolio composition. And we calibrate the model to wealth and consumption survey data in the first paper with the wealth share of capitalists C as our key distributional measure, outcome measure, and 6 parameters of the differential saving rates, the typical post-Keynesian differential saving rates, the profit share, the share in labor income, and the profit-generating wealth share as a nod to the Marxist literature in this area. Now, this is really just to show you this is a standard post-Keynesian model in the Kalecki-Steindl tradition, where income is divided between the wage bill and total income for capitalists and workers, and they are sort of the inverse of each other. So you have the labor share of capitalists and 1 minus the labor share of workers, and the same for the profit-generating share in assets for the total capital income. We have a standard Kalecki-Steindl model also in terms of the investment function, and consumption consists takes place out of income subject to a saving rate. And as you see in the basic version of the model, the equilibrium is rather simple. It's a tractable standard post-Keynesian macroeconomic model where the relative saving rates and the profit share determine the equilibrium value of the capitalist share in wealth, and that is wealth inequality as we measured in the model. Now, empirically, we compare this to the estimated distribution, again, from HFCS data. In the blue bars, you see for a number of European countries how the wealth inequality was empirically, and then the estimated model effects of this wealth share of the capitalists. Now, I wouldn't put too much store on the precise numbers here. The key point that we were making with this paper was first, this is stable. So even endogenizing the wealth share yields stable outcomes and doesn't necessarily, at least, lead to an explosion or implosion of the model. And for the point of this presentation here, what is important is that the wealth inequality is predicted by the model to rise further in every single country. In some countries minimally, but essentially it's increasing. We then use this model to investigate other aspects, such as aggregate demand, showing that with an exogenous profit rate, by endogenizing the wealth share, you make the demand regimes more wage-led, which can potentially then even lead to a regime shift from a profit-led to a wage-led wage accumulation regime. And we also looked at the dynamics of the adjustment process. Most recently, we worked on a paper that endogenizes the profit rate, and this now relates to the point of the lecture here. Because first of all, you do see that at the top left, the wealth share continues to increase. So after a transition period, again, this key point that wealth inequality is going to, wealth share of capitalists always, and therefore wealth inequality is going to rise in this model, in this post-Keynesian model of wealth inequality. And on the bottom left, and that is the key point here now, the growth rate is minimally affected, right? So again, as Özlem Onaran already said yesterday evening, these models have small effects on growth, and therefore also from the wealth inequality, there is no, so our model reproduces the very small effects of growth on growth that are typical for these types of models. And from a climate point of view, there is no negative feedback effect of this increasing wealth inequality, which I do believe is at least it's, we can say that it's likely to remain very high, but there will be no attenuating effect on growth that might help us with the climate issue. That is sort of the key point here. These models do not lead us to expect to expect substantial attenuating effects on growth from increasing wealth inequality. So, as a conclusion for this second part of this presentation, first of all, you can criticize our model on many counts, and it has rightly been done so, but I do think it captures one aspect of reality, in that wealth inequality is likely to rise further, or as a minimum sort of fallback position, it is likely to remain very high. And I think that tallies very well with the empirical data, which is really not capable of measuring differences in wealth inequality, because we have such poor survey data that is very bad at capturing the very top of the distribution. So I think extremely high wealth inequality, which even with this data we are able to measure, is likely to remain high or even increase further, as our model predicts. Now, a second point that we made was that growth regimes are likely to become more wage-led and equivalently less profit-led if the profit rate is exogenous. However, with an endogenous profit rate, higher wealth concentration will reduce growth, but for the purpose of a socio-ecological transition, not substantially. So there will be minimal effects on growth, and they will not help very much with the socio-ecological transition. That is perfect, thank you. Right, so now for the last part of this presentation, I'll be presenting two separate works. You'll see the art is not quite as clear as for the first ones. First, we'll be talking about wealth inequality and emissions, and secondly about social norms, because I do believe that this is where, as Lem already did, and also then Elson did yesterday, tying in the question of patriarchy and of social norms with the socio-ecological transition is crucial, as we also discussed yesterday after the plenary session. So the second part of this third part will be looking at how life events affect hours spent on unpleasant household tasks for women and men. So to start off with, we continue with the Germany-centered focus of these presentations, and I do apologize for that. But following work from Chazelle and Yannick Rehm, we looked at the distribution of emissions by wealth. And you can see how extremely unequally this is distributed. You have net wealth in 0.1 percentiles, so in a thousandth of net wealth on the bottom axis. And on the y-axis, you have emissions in tons. And you can see how extremely concentrated CO2 emissions in Germany are. And this is true for virtually all, for most countries, right? Again, this is a data issue. We very rarely have very good wealth data. The SEP here is that we're using here is one of the best sources for Germany. We argue even better than the HFCS. And this extreme concentration is mainly due to the ownership of business assets of firms, right? And so linking this to the gender wealth gap, of course, at the top of the wealth distribution, that is more male than female, as that literature shows, and where there is a lot of wealth, that is the part of the wealth distribution that benefits the most from emissions, from CO2 emissions, or formulated differently, is responsible for the by far largest share of CO2 emissions in Germany. Now, so that is the one tied to the socio-ecological transition, and the other one is now this question of social norms and how persistent they are. Here we use, again, SEP data. It was discussed, I can only repeat, it was already, the issues were already pointed out yesterday. Here we see them in action. We have time use data from the SEP again, which is very problematic and very poorly measured. And even with this data, what we see is that hours worked on unpleasant household tasks, such as daily cooking, daily shopping, things like shopping for necessities, after cohabitation, so after a couple moves in together, women and men move in together, increases substantially. Now, this is a life event study. We're using a probabilistic estimator. Can discuss all of that in detail later if you want to. But if you look at time zero, the moment when couples move together, you can see that women substantially increase their work in the household on these unpleasant tasks, as do men in the first year, right? And then it goes right back to where it was. So it's rather short-lived, the effect for men that we observe, at least in this data. Now, birth, as I'm sure all of you know from sort of anecdotal experience, the household work after birth increases substantially for women after the first birth, after this life event. Whereas for men, we actually find it decreases, which goes beyond the literature, which usually finds no effect on men. So after the first birth of a child, on average, of course, women work substantially more, while men work less, rather than maybe helping with these unpleasant tasks. We're excluding childcare here, right? So this is really just sort of the tedious housework. So then we had we asked ourselves, what then happens after divorce, right? You would assume. And in fact, the effects do reverse. So women are able to reduce their work on these unpleasant tasks, whereas men go back to pulling their own weight and working more after divorce. Although not fully. They do reverse, but not fully, the effects. So, as a last content slide, there are just flashlights on this on further research that I've done that sort of relates to the socio-ecological transition. If you look not at the richest but at the poorest, at the bottom end, we find in causal, but what I really believe is the correlations that we see in this work, that energy poverty has negative effects on health, right? So again, in Germany, but this is something that holds really, was originally developed for low-income countries and has sort of trickled down towards high-income countries. But even for Germany, we see that energy poverty, on top of, after controlling for income poverty, leads to worse health outcomes. And given the energy price shocks that we've seen, I do believe that this is extremely pertinent. Now, looking at the social norms, and what we also find is that unexpected childcare burdens fall mainly on women. We were looking at the COVID school closures there and showing that women reduced their paid work hours substantially more than men in Austria. In very sort of recent work that is still in the process of being developed, we're looking at more traditional gender attitudes in Germany and how they are linked to lower concerns about the climate. I think this speaks very much to current political trends in both the US and also in Germany and other countries, how this anti-emancipation movement is very much linked to the anti-climate movement and then to other political aspects that I personally find very concerning. And the last paper that I wanted to mention here is where we show, again, work that is very much underway in export-oriented growth models, that they have different effects by gender and race. And that is sort of the last bit of the intersectionality that I was able to salvage from my initial promise. All right, so to conclude, wealth inequality is gendered. That is something that I firmly believe, not across the vast majority of the distribution, because there is barely any wealth across the vast majority of the distribution in high-income countries, but at the top of the distribution, where there is wealth, we do see that that this top is more male than female, that there is a gender wealth gap. The second point that I hope you will take from today is that wealth inequality is likely to remain high or even rise further if you believe our model, with little to no attenuating effects on growth. And at the same time, a very large share of CO2 emissions are generated by the top of the wealth distribution. And again, I think that is a very stable finding. This extremely unequal wealth distribution with an even more unequal CO2 emission, I believe is rather solid. And that implies, taken together, that the direct effect of wealth inequality is very large, and the potential sort of beneficial effect on growth that might take place is most likely to be very irrelevant, unfortunately. Well, depending on your views. And the third point, and that is sort of a little bit more speculative than the first two, I do believe that socio-ecological transition will require a focus on green and purple jobs, as Lemonaran calls them, and a redistribution of work and care time. But what I do see in my research so far, and I'm sure you all sort of have a gut feeling about this, traditional gender norms are incredibly persistent. What we can have shown is that decision-making power within couples is linked to higher wealth, especially for men at the top. So where it matters, the hand is on the wealth of men. And the second sort of nugget of support for this hypothesis that I was able to give you is that unpleasant household tasks are performed more often by women in couples after life events. So thank you very much for your attention.
Go for dinner at 8 p.m. at the latest, so this leaves us with plenty of time for a couple of rounds of questions, followed by answers from our speakers. So who has questions? This gentleman here in the front. And please briefly say your name and your affiliation.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm Jerome Dehaneau from the Open University in the UK. This to you, Miriam, for the last presentation. It's just when you were showing, it's just out of curiosity, the graph with the net wealth of in Germany, was it, and the CO2 emissions. When you said that it was linked to the business ownership, so that everything happens at the top, but how is the CO2 attributed to each percentile? Because you could also imagine, you know, whoever buys the car is responsible for the business that emits in the production of the car as well as the consumption of so it's not necessarily the owner of the business that would to whom we would attribute that. But I don't know how you decide on that. But just curiosity. Thank you.
Hans-Jörg.
Thank you for these nice presentations. I have a question to the second presentation. You mentioned this production function, and you did not speak about economies of scale, but I guess you also have to exclude economies of scale in the model. I feel these are very strange models if you have to rely on a certain technology. And you argued you have to assume diseconomies of scale or decreasing returns of scale, yeah? Normally, I've learned is a Cobb-Douglas production function. If you don't have constant returns to scale, something is left. Can you explain that a little bit? Because that's not completely clear to me. Then to Miriam, I have a question. I think it's really clear the super rich have much higher CO2 emission. However, what do you think if we take, let's say, some wealth from the super rich and give it to the poor? Probably the super rich will just continue to consume what they do, and the poor will consume more. That would be ecologically negative, so to say. What is your opinion about that?
Thank you. Özlem.
Thank you very much, Özlem Onaran. Excellent panel with really rigorous research behind every word you said. So there was a great overview of the work you have been doing for almost a decade or more in some of the cases for all three of you. So I have questions or comments on all of the three speakers, if I may. If I start with the order of the presentation is really exciting when you talk about robotization and the effect that you found on women's employment. I would probably do two more things around that. First, I would like to see a non-linear effect coming into picture. Basically, put robotization square maybe in that equation. It's simple. The other is really something that I have been saying. When we work with ratios, employment share of women in total employment, in addition to that, I would also really like to see the impact of robotization on women's employment, and then a separate estimation on men's employment. The issue is, I want to know if maybe robots are substituting both men and women, just more so men. I don't now know from that estimation, and it's, I'm really very curious, so it's really a question. This is already done and dusted and published, but the data is for you to tell us next time you come here, so thanks for that. In the order of the presenters, moving to Ajit, I mean, I've been a great fan of all the work that you have been doing with modeling at Levy. And I like the simple exercise you did to demonstrate the limitations of CGE. That was very helpful and learning exercise, and you know, great message that comes out of that. But obviously, they have moved on from that sort of very simple framework to rather complicated versions of their household economics, where there's gender. Well, they call it men and women. They would never use the term gender, but there is different preferences, different, and there is investment, and investment in both human capital and other types of investment. So probably we want to engage with their full models as well, but still come at the conclusions you're coming. I think the message will be the same. But for me, the issue I would like to take with the mainstream models is the lack of demand as a determinant of investment, and how they always would arrive at full employment. And I know that you work with models elsewhere, with the SFC, gendered models, you know, extended with finance, where there is a very active role for investment-led, demanded investment. So how would that play in our gendered version versus their version, where investment is just determined by savings, isn't it? So anyway, that's something to engage with, I suppose, in maybe if you write a paper out of that for Egypt, I would like to see that. So Miriam, thanks. That's really, again, a great overview of all the interesting work you're doing, gendering aspects of macroeconomics. In the work on wealth inequality, it would be probably very interesting to look at also different types of assets. So financial assets, land, and business, and how that is gendered. Because you did actually say it in your presentation that a lot of the concentration of wealth of men is due to business ownership. So how are the gaps looking like in the other assets? It would be, I was curious. Sorry, I did the bad thing of learning from my students and taking notes on my phone, and it went black, but yes. And obviously in your dense simulations, it would be nice to have gendered behavioral differences of workers and capitalists. I don't think anyone has really done that in the Kaleckian tradition, but you have the data for that. So you can think of different investment behavior of men versus women capitalists. You know, in the limited work we did, we look at different consumption behavior of men and women workers, and the capitalist aggregated, but even that should be gendered. And last question, of course, you are talking about a paper about wealth accumulation, then there should be probably wealth effects on consumption and investment too, in the model itself. Yeah, sorry, there was a lot of unorganized thoughts, but you can pick up the ones you want.
Okay, so I think the question covered sufficient ground for. We have several, like more rounds later. Do you want to start, Is? Is that okay?
Should I?
No, you just speak.
Okay. So, Oslen, thank you so much for your comments. You are lucky because I intentionally left that set of results out of the presentation, but they are in the paper. Not the non-linearities, that is very cool because it was like bringing what I brought, what I found in the first paper to the kind of the second one. But in the paper, you will find different estimations for women's employment and men's employment. And what I found is that for female employment, once we use the GMM, we endogenize robots, we endogenize female labor force participation, the effect only remains for female employment, not for male employment. And this goes along the lines of a very recent working paper of publishing from the World Bank working paper series, that they found the same. Robots in this specific, I can only talk about this specific set of countries that I am using, I have data for. It seems that it's really driving female employment.
Do you want to go next?
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much for the comments and the observations. I'm not sure whether I understood the comment about the returns to scale entirely, but let me try addressing the concern by saying that the point about that part of the argument was to demonstrate that some assumption regarding returns to scale is required for the existence of well-behaved factor functions, de facto demand functions. So I consider decreasing returns to scale as the one that would produce well-behaved factor functions, but which, in my view, would not make much sense in a world with just male and female labor factors of production and a large number of households. So the alternative assumption is that of constant returns to scale, which then, as I pointed out, leads to the non-substitution theorem, breaking the demand between the preference parameters, which are crucial in the model, the theory, to explain the gender division of labor and the distribution of income. So I think that is what I was trying to say. About something being left when there is constant returns to scale, I'm really not sure, because in the... Oh, with decreasing returns to scale, yes.
My argument was we should not accept... Thank you. So my argument was we should not accept models which cannot include economies of scale.
Oh, I agree with you completely. I was just saying that for decreasing returns to scale, it's problematic. That's what I was saying. I would argue that there are increasing returns to scale, especially when it comes to things like childcare.
Yeah, so
Yeah, that definitely, I agree with you, yeah.
So
I was just trying to say, but that's then problems, that raises more difficult problems for the theory.
Yeah.
If you allow, yeah, right. But any increasing returns to scale within this theory can be adapted as a special case of the constant returns to scale technology with the parameter, right, with the scale parameter, like Rehm and others do in their endogenous growth models. So it could be accommodated within this theory. The point about using more complicated CG models, I mean, see, what I was thinking, Oslam, was that if you, a lot of times people, at least including me, when I was confronted with the CGE models, I had difficulty really understanding what is the economics behind it, you know. I love the CGE models because they follow the accounting. The accounting is watertight with the social accounting matrices. We follow pretty much the same methodology as an empirical methodology. It makes a lot of sense. But one of the difficulties is that with the large number of sectors and then the large number of equations and then the large number of parameters, it really becomes a bit hard. The actual economic mechanisms become a little bit opaque. So what I tried to do was to use a very simple framework with the allocation of female and male labor between SNA and non-SNA activities, and what would the theory say in that context. Theory is not something that I would like to hear, but how do you have an explanation of prices and distribution of income within that framework? Is that possible or not? And my answer was no. So I don't know whether I can make, it adds anything to the argument if I say the same thing in a more complicated model. So that's one thing from the point of view of exposition and from making the argument. The second is that if you introduce additional complications, additional problems come with them. For example, if within this framework, if we were to introduce intermediate inputs, or produce means of production like capital goods, then a whole series of problems which was raised in the capital controversy, Cambridge capital controversy literature, that come into play. Again, challenging the rationale of using the general equilibrium framework as a framework to understand distribution and prices. So I don't know how far we can go with, complicating the model. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the questions. They're all very, very pertinent and lead to me to think a lot more. So the first one, on net wealth and CO2 emissions, the approach is consistent. So it's allocating production emissions across the wealth distribution, right? So it's the total emissions allocated across the wealth distribution. Now, the question that lies behind this is who earns the capital income from emissions, right? Or formulated differently, who earns the wealth underlying emissions? And that is a valid question, I would argue, and one that makes sense to answer. On top of the question, who consumes the goods and services that are produced using emissions, right? It's just a different way of looking at the question. Incidentally, and we were just discussing this today in the morning, the excellent session on ecological economics, I truly think that when it comes to climate topics, very often we fall back on a very, and I'm not saying you are, but very often in a general discussion, we're falling back on a neoclassical standard where we're just looking at consumption, whereas in our macroeconomic equations, it's very clear that y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Right? But now, all of a sudden, because, of course, of some lobbying efforts by oil companies, as is well known with the carbon footprint, we are just looking at consumption, completely leaving out investment, as if that was not part of our macroeconomic understanding. The same way, income, all of a sudden, we're only looking at income, but not at savings, right? We're only looking at the consumption, only looking at consumption, not at savings, right? As post-Keynesian macroeconomists, we know that income is split up into consumption and savings, but we're just looking at savings and ignore consumption with a carbon footprint and ignoring savings. And we also know that this has massive distributional implications. We know that the different savings rates from our theory, back to front, and we're leaving out the part that is concentrated at the top. So again, I'm not saying this is this is just something I need to vent at the regular. And then the other part, the third part, why I think there is some resistance, again, not by you, but in general, of looking at wealth in general, is because it is at the root of our economic system. And that wealth inequality is so high and so stable and so unknown by the gut feeling, while we know a lot about income inequality, wealth inequality, that it's as high in high-income countries as the worst countries in the world regarding income inequality is something that very often we don't have sort of as part of our regular curricular training. And that, I think, is because, again, from a Marxist perspective, it lies at the root, it's the means of production that define it, and that's why I think it's so important to look there. Second question on redistribution. Yes, again, we discussed this today in the morning, started by two excellent papers by Martin Medilanis with Svenja Flechter and Alex Kushansky and Rafael Wildauer, who are working on exactly this topic. Now, what Martin and Svenja were doing is looking at country, within and between country differentiation. And within countries, you see exactly the marginal propensity to emit that in high-income countries, that is not universal, but that's a high-income perspective, is higher at the bottom of the income distribution, right? So that is why environmental taxes are regressive in high-income countries, right? Exactly what you were saying. However, I would have three answers to that, I would argue, simplistic view. First of all, we know that the types of wealth differ strongly across the wealth distribution. At the top, you have business wealth. In the middle, In Germany, that is until the middle, but in UK or other high-income countries, that goes a little bit further down. It's housing wealth. And the bottom, there is nothing, right? I mean, you have a car and maybe a financial account, but basically no wealth, right? And so if you do distribute away from the top, it depends on how you do it, whether you redistribute ownership of firms, but that's not what is usually suggested in wealth taxation or, so we are talking about, you know, small redistribution. And there, if you build up the wealth of the middle, most likely what you're going to be doing is dealing with housing wealth. And we know how to decarbonize that, at least in theory. Right? I mean, that is something that can be done with construction, a lot of, you know, wood-based construction, insulation, all that kind of, that is not rocket science. The second argument I would have is on the dynamics. We know empirically that the top of the distribution has increased their emissions while the entire rest in Europe, certainly, and also worldwide, has decarbonized. So even if we sort of accept this the marginal propensity to emit sort of theorem, which I do think empirically we see, the other empirical data shows that, first of all, what is happening is that the rich are emitting more over time, and the bottom 90 to 95% are emitting less. And we also know that the type of consumption that takes place in the middle and the bottom globally now is easier to decarbonize. Because the very rich, what they do is they have essentially travel emissions from flying and maybe yachts and SUVs. So, and that is extremely hard to decarbonize. We don't know how to do that. Certainly not for flying, and also for the other aspects, not on a global scale. Third point I would have is the political economy aspect. The more concentrated wealth is, the harder it becomes to decarbonize because it's entrenched in our economic system, and the incumbents have strong resistance. And we see the research on this very clearly, that there is very strong resistance to decarbonization of the production process and the consumption side. And that stems really, I mean, it's very clear which groups in society are refusing and supporting political parties that are refusing to do that. And that's like business, well, just to be clear about this. Now, the last question, thanks a lot for your suggestions, Eslem. I'm happy to discuss that further. I just wanted to make one point on the types of assets, because of course we've looked at this a lot. We do see some effects there, but they're very minor. I actually have work on differential returns that would have fit here very well, but we don't see gender effects, and that's why I actually took it out actively, because differential rates of return based on portfolio composition, right? And we simply do not find gender defects there. So although we have this business wealth concentrated at the very top, it just doesn't propagate far enough throughout the distribution to show up in aggregates. That's how I interpret this. So it's business wealth concentrated at the very top, but this is, you know, very badly captured in our data. And there's really interesting qualitative research on that coming out of French, from French researchers who have looked into this, but it's a concentration of business wealth at the top that is hard to capture with surveys, I think.
Thank you. No, that's fine. I've already seen more hands going up. Gregor.
Well, thank you. Sorry for skipping the line maybe, but my name is Gregor Simoniuk, and thank you for 3 very instructive and insightful presentations. I have a question and maybe a comment on your answer, Miriam, which is perhaps unfair. But so my comment is a little critical. I fully agree with you that we can measure emissions from various perspectives of the national accounts, so that's totally okay to do that. I'm not sure I buy the argument that if we redistribute wealth, that's somehow going to, that, you know, it's easier to decarbonize the wealth of the middle class because of the input-output structure of production, that you still need the emissions-intensive sectors that are owned by rich people to produce those final goods that are maybe in scope 1 and 2 emissions not so emissions intensive, but that's just a side argument. My main point was that, but it builds on that, is that do you also have data on what types of businesses men and women own, or mostly men own, and whether there's investment behavior by those few women that do own wealth that is maybe different and maybe more decarbonized investments, so that they build up the low carbon economy of the future more than men, which I wouldn't be surprised if they did. And can one do research on this? Thanks so much.
Thank you. There were questions in the front here.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Suhail Mulvite. I was interested in the different types of wealth. Ignacio Pinto, who's sitting over there, has done very nice gender analysis of wealth in the UK. I suspect it doesn't go up to the very highest levels that you're talking about, but what comes out very clearly there is the biggest gender difference is in pension wealth. Now that might be quite different in Austria from the UK, but I would say that I don't know about the overall scale, but Ignacio can tell us, but I would have thought it's comparable to housing wealth. But the difference is that housing wealth is jointly owned and pension wealth is individually owned. I was also thinking about quite different paper, but there's been quite a lot of stuff done on intra-household saving behaviour. And in particular, pensions are often used for that. And there's a very nice paper whose authors I can't remember, I'm afraid, which shows that whoever has decision-making power within the household accumulates pension wealth according to as suits them. So that might be partly an explanation of different accumulation of wealth, but also might relate to the issues that you talk about emissions, in the sense that pensions might be more controllable in terms of where they are allowed to invest in terms of emissions. There might be more scope for policy with respect to pension wealth and with respect to business wealth.
Thanks. Who else wants to? Please. Either way, we take both questions.
Just a very short one. Even if it's males owning the wealth, what about the widows? Because, I mean, they have a longer life expectancy, so I would somehow expect, at least still, I mean, it may change with the younger cohorts that also have different occupations and are kind of taking up bad habits by males, but at least for a certain cohort, the baby boomers, there should, at some point in time, some part of the wealth should then transfer to the females. And I was wondering why it does not show up in your statistics.
Business wealth is...
Yeah, I mean, is that because you have business wealth in there and it's, well...
It's inherited by the son.
Yeah,
Hi, I'm Deborah Nunes, Monmouth University. Thank you very much for a very qualified and interesting panel. My question I've seen a lot of work on like growth and development and how it changes values for women, mostly from like modernization theory type of folks. So I'm very interested by your labor force participation and left versus right wing positions. I have a ton of questions. I'm gonna make just two. First is, how do you capture that? Because if it's only through voting, you would, at least I would expect you to see radical left, well, better said, people that like to think that they are the radical left not voting as much, right? So you'd be losing part of that sample. And if it's like based on behavior or discourse, we are in this era that a lot of people like Naomi Klein calls the diagonal politics, right? That you see folks appropriating the anti-big pharma, my body, my choice stuff to be anti-vaxxers. Or you see trad wives appropriating the anti-GMO, anti-heavily industrialized food to be a stay-at-home full-time mother full of conservative values. So how do you see that?
So basically...
let's...
sorry.
Did you have more questions, or what was that it? Okay. Okay, why don't you start these?
I just wanted to play. So we measure, we use this Likert type scale from 1 to 10. 1 is being leftist and 10 is being rightist. And it's, we don't see whether they vote or not. They asked a representative sample every month, a representative sample from the citizens of Spain since 1993. In this political spectrum where you sit, I mean, where you are placed. So we use this. And then we have been doing different analysis, and we decided to capture what's your probability of being on the left. And we define being on the left as being 3 or less in the 1 to 10 scale. Using different cutoffs doesn't make difference. It's like 4 and less being left, or 2 and less being leftist. We see the same results. Of course, this speaks a lot to the tri-wives movement. That is, I mean, tri-wife movements who are full-time employees, I mean, full-time influencers working behind the scenes. So yeah, we also, I couldn't have shown this because still didn't allow me. So we have the evolution of political ideology for women and men by different labor market status. Something that is beautiful from our data set is that we have the differentiation between pensioners who never have been working in the labor market. This is only for women because the men who are pensioners who have never been working in the labor market, for men, it was like 0.001%. It was like minimal. So we have that. Women who are pensioners never work in the labor market, and also women who have retired, who were working in the labor market and no more. Then we have homemaker women. Again, we don't have homemaker men because it's like 0.00001%. And we see really that the difference between women and men in their political ideology comes from these women that are, and something that we have been, my co-author and I, we have been discussing a lot, is like the fact that you are within your walls at home and you are not exposed to progressive ideas, feminist ideas, and you have not faced discrimination in the labor market, you remain, you know, attached to these traditional ideas, so you are really on the right wing. Once you enter the labor market and you face wage discrimination, gender segregation, and many other things, and you are exposed, of course, those who enter in the labor market have a higher level of educational attainment. They might be graduated from college, they might be reading market output for sure, so they become more left-wing.
Yeah, thanks a lot again for the questions. I'll start with Heike Jöpkes because it's easiest to answer. It's because we basically look at working age population. So we throw the widows out. Also because, yeah, in any case, yeah, we're happy to discuss and look at this further, but that's the reason. The second question by Gregor, thank you. I mean, I'm sure I'm very happy to discuss this further, but essentially your point could be taken as saying, well, there's no hope, right? I mean, whether we distribute the wealth or not, it will always, it cannot be decarbonized and that's it. I'm sure that's not what you meant, but that would be sort of a conclusion from that. And I would argue, well, look at the sectors which are still highly carbon intensive, maybe even going the wrong direction. I know it only for Germany, but I suspect it's similar for the US. You have transportation that's going the wrong way, and that is entirely policy driven, which is a huge, you know, political economy issue and power of elites issue. You have energy, which is decarbonizing fast, by any means not fast enough, but really coming down tremendously. And we know how to do that. We know how to decarbonize energy in theory. We're not putting it into practice fast enough, but again, it's not rocket science. We can do it in principle. Not for the massive amounts of energy if we have no sort of accompanying policies regarding reduction of energy demand. We cannot electrify our entire transport system, land transport system. We cannot electrify airplanes at this stage. It's just not feasible, at least long distance. So we will need some carbon catch and storage for negative effects, but essentially we know what to do with energy in theory. From a physical sort of natural sciences point of view. And the third one that I would say is an issue is construction. Here too, we will need some negative emissions, but if we move away from the way we are constructing right now, it is possible. I'm actually working on a research, or starting a research project with a PhD at this point, looking into the construction sector. So again, I think these big ones that I would see, and I'm again happy to discuss further, they're doable. And once you get over then the social sciences and political economy side of it, if you ever do, that is something that is doable. And for me, the prerequisite would be a redistribution of wealth and deconcentration of economic and political power, which maybe, it's a wish list at this point with everything going in the other direction. So I'm not saying this is, something that's happening, but in theory, it's not something that is inconceivable and nothing we can do anyway, no matter who holds the wealth. Type of thing. And what ties into this is, I think that we have very strong democratic majorities for climate action if it's, and with the determinants being if one is affected oneself, but if it's effective and if the distributional effects are sort of taken into account. And I think policies that sort of touch these three bases have a very good chance of garnering democratic support. Similar to how wealth taxes have democratic support, and there's no chance of pushing them through. So it's a power issue in my view, in large part. I mean, there is of course a lot of subtleties and a lot of inconsistencies in opinion polls on these issues, but I do think if one has policies that are effective and are perceived as such by the electorate and address distributional concerns, I think that would be sufficient for moving forward with democratic majorities. And then it's a question of political power and political will, and that is where we are really hitting the roadblocks. And then the last point, thank you very much for the question on pension wealth. We have actually looked at that as well. Of course, it matters much less, as you say, in continental Europe, because it's about capitalized pension systems. And even in Germany and in Central Europe, where we do see large differences, is indeed private pension wealth. And I think there's a whole story to that. There's also a lot of research on that because there's good data for the US, as you said. But the hope that pension funds would be sort of the drivers for decarbonization, it's, I think, similar to that ETF funds, and because they're now looking at the entire economy, are sort of interested in climate change because the entire portfolio will be affected, and they have been disappointed again and again. The entire experience of the Californian pension funds trying to change sort of the shareholder value model and finding out that really what ends up mattering more is that the companies in which they're holding shares lay off their workers because their members, the owners of the pensions, in the end care about the returns to the pensions more than they do about the fellow workers' employment, I think is an example to that. So maybe we have some hope from that side, but I wouldn't bank on it.
I'm good, that's all good.
Okay, so I think we can have a final round of questions. Who wants to ask a question? Please.
Thank you. I'm Aida Mirzai, Portland State University, Oregon. My question is for Karen. In regard to wealth difference, I have done some work on the US, on survey data. Can some of the differences come from risk aversion in investment? Based on our observation, women usually are more conservative, men are risk taker. So as a result, we are going to see differences in outcome. Thank you.
So this is your last chance to ask a question. If not, then...
Thanks again for the question. We have actually a PhD student here, Caroline Diller, who is working exactly, but I cannot see her right now. Ah, there she is. Right, so if you want to speak to her, please feel free. I can only repeat what I've learned from her. And that is, do correct me if I'm wrong. So first of all, the risk aversion measures that we have are deeply flawed, especially with gender respects. And the psychological literature has been very good in sort of trying to identify the difference in stated risk aversion and then actual risk behavior. And that's still in sort of controlled sort of behavioral experiment type of settings, and the stated risk behavior, and you have very gendered responses in stated risk behavior. Again, Caroline, please do correct, like scream if I'm misrepresenting stuff here. But essentially, the way I understood it is that women say, "Oh, I'm really very, safe," and means, "Oh, I'm very, risk taking," and then once you actually, even in controlled in experimental settings, once you actually have them take risks, you find that these differences level out largely. And then, of course, there's an entire feminist economics critique of these risk aversion studies by prominent authors, and I'm not going to stick out my neck because I'm not sure. Was it Julie Nelson? Yes, Julie. Yeah, by Julie Nelson, who's really criticized this this idea. And the point is, it's very gendered, and it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny.
I hope you all enjoyed listening to the three presentations and also to the debate as much as I have. So let's thank our three speakers in due manner. Yeah, it's almost 8 o'clock. It's been a long day. I don't think we have to be ashamed of our workload today. So dinner will be served as yesterday, both in the restaurant and in the foyer. Enjoy the rest of the evening and see you all tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Well, no big deal.